As we continue to welcome people and people are signing into the chat box, I thought I would share just a statement that we've been thinking about a little, that our hope among the four of us is that although we're standing in the middle of September, we are pointed toward the beginning of a new liturgical season, a new liturgical year. And we really want this moment to help focus our attention on that sense of the hope in Jesus Christ, that we are together waiting for his coming, but we are recognizing more than perhaps in recent time the suffering of God's people. And that in that place there is hope for restoration. In that place, all that is broken in the world can be made new, and that we will live together in this becoming that God is already undertaking. So we four have committed that hope is in fact the light by which we will live, and we know that's true for you too. So we are glad that you're here. I'm going to say a little bit more in a minute about what gathered us together, but remembering that this is not our project. This is very much of God.
Delighted to see the ecumenical presence here. We have United Methodists and Presbyterians, as well as Episcopalians and perhaps others. Welcome, everyone.
So I'm going to stop screen sharing and we're going to begin. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking an hour and a half out of your time to be with us. We recognize that every body represented there in the chat box and those who might watch this later as a recording are part of our shared vocation, our shared sense of call to serve God through Jesus Christ in this world. And I am Lisa Kimball. I'm the Associate Dean of Lifelong Learning here at Virginia Seminary, and felt that I have been hearing, as many of you may be feeling or hearing, that a lot of our church leaders are at the edge of what they would consider their knowing. They're at the edge of the training that they experienced in preparation for the ministries in which they find themselves. Many people are on the precipice of exhaustion, and many people are anxious about their capacity as leaders. That's a given in the circumstances under which we find ourselves. And what, therefore, I asked myself, might the arrival of a new liturgical year offer us as Christian people, even as we recognize that we're entering Advent and Christmas and Epiphany, the cycle of incarnation. We're entering it without the bells and whistles that we're used to. We're entering it without the promises of those incredible traditions that bring goosebumps to our arms, that gather our families in traditional ways. And many of us are weighed down by loss, by grief, by anger, by despair. Many of us are uncertain about the road ahead, the physical road ahead, the stability of our congregations and their survival, the future of this earth, this planet, as fires rage and floods pour. So it is a difficult time. We also know, as among us, the four of us, that less is more. We believe that we are called to live our lives together as Christians and ministry leaders with integrity. We believe that we're called to build on our strengths, to use the gifts that God has given us, both our personal gifts and our communal gifts. And that by honoring our limitations and our gifts, we together can more fully serve the God who gave us that life. So we are not alone. We know this. We are not alone. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Sarah, the God of Rebecca, the God of Rachel, God is with us. And today is designed to be a time when you, we hope, will leave with your confidence renewed, with a sense of your capacity to lead others at this critical time, this critical juncture across the threshold into a new church year, a time when you can believe that God is with us and that we can see redemption again on the horizon. So I had this idea, but I could not do this alone. And I invited three of my wise and gifted Virginia Seminary colleagues to join me because they bring particular perspective to this conversation. So with me today is the Reverend Dr. James Farwell, our Professor of Theology and Liturgy at Virginia Seminary. With me is Dr. Marty Burnett, our Associate Professor of Church Music recently on the faculty. She's arrived under COVID. She has lived all of her time with us in socially distant ways and largely on Zoom, and she is incredibly good-natured. And the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, our professor of Old Testament. So we are here together. We view our time with you as a gift, both that we hope to offer, but also one that we can receive. And we think of it as a way about what does it mean for us to be fully human in this time, to be embodied, to be hope incarnate, hence the title of the webinar. The four of us have been thinking a lot about all of this and what it means to carry hope within our particular bodies, our tired, our zoomed out bodies. These vessels are weary, but they're also hopeful. And so we just hope, and we think that maybe an opportunity is before all of us to retrieve the depth of this new season, this new cycle of incarnation. And we hope that today will help you see that. So to start, we're going to do something very simple. I'm going to ask my colleagues to just briefly share with us something that they have either observed or learned about the people of God at worship as they have journeyed through these months of pandemic and struggle. So Judy, do you want to share a little bit about what you've seen?
Sure. I think that in my church context, we have discovered that people are finding new ways to experience God's presence, all the while recovering old ways. So what I love is hearing about people who have recovered the hymn. They have been singing hymns more than ever before as a practice. And so that's been really important. And we've been praying a lot more corporately on the phone, which has really been useful.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. James.
A lot has struck me during this period, inspired me, surprised me, amazed me, the resilience of people, lay leaders and clergy in responding to this. A few things have horrified me, as you might expect, but the thing I want to tag here at the moment is I've been rather amazed by the contextual nature of this crisis. People are making different kinds of liturgical responses in different places depending on the conditions of the pandemic, whether they're in a hotspot or not, whether they're in a place that can manage to socially gather outside, or are they completely forbidden even of that? What are the variances around how many people can gather? Some people at this point are able to do a very carefully orchestrated form of Eucharist. Others are not, and do not anticipate that being on their horizon anytime in the near future. So I just have been really struck by what a patchwork we're in the middle of as we try to help one another, because our contextual differences are so profound from place to place. It calls for a lot of generosity and as much patience and openness to one another that we can muster as we all make different kind of strategic responses to this.
And Marty.
Well, I'm a church musician, and I've spent a lot of time talking to church musicians during this time. There's several things that strike me. First of all, it's been a period of great creativity, and we should focus on that positive aspect. People have been doing amazing creative work in church music during this pandemic. Also, church musicians have often stepped up to the front to take care of technology. In terms of most of our churches now are doing some kind of live streaming, and often musicians have the skills and the interest to be able to help make that happen and make worship available. And that's been remarkable to watch. It's been fun just to watch church services from around the country and around the world during this time. But the other part that's the flip side of that coin is the exhaustion and burnout, which we're really starting to see now among a lot of church musicians, and I imagine other lay employees and clergy as well. Everybody stepped up to the plate, and for a while we thought, well, it'll all be better by Easter, well, by Pentecost, well, by fall. Well, now we're talking about Advent and Christmas. So I think we need to also look at self-care and what's sustainable, and I'll be talking about that a bit today. I'll just conclude by saying that that one of my friends recently said that he was trying to think outside the box, and I commented, for church musicians, at least for many of us, the box is gone. There is no box. The traditional ways we've planned for Christmas don't even apply this year. So that's sad in a way, and there's grief over it, but it's also an opportunity to approach the incarnational cycle in fresh and creative ways.
Thank you. I saw a comment fly by that there's a musician, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Oh, here it is, Gwen, that she had organ students who are young people record over the summer, and she's been using that music. So that speaks to something I would say, which is I have seen leadership emerge and gifts emerge from corners of our congregations that often were overlooked in the past. So younger people, some of the people who had not physically been able to attend church regularly because of health issues before, who've discovered that they have a vital role as a lay leader or a prayer leader. Some of those people Judy mentioned that pick up the phone and call someone else and just spontaneously pray with them. There have been some extraordinary things happening across generations. And I would also add that the fatigue that I hear about now with households with children who are also living at the intersection of homeschooling, trying to keep work and income coming through, and are also trying to be faithful to their faith community. It's stretching people all the way. So we are now going to be blessed by a reflection by our friend and colleague, Judy Fentress-Williams. So let me offer that.
Our scripture lesson is Isaiah 61. I'm going to read the first 4 verses. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. The Lord has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display the Lord's glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. This Isaiah text is the reading for the first Sunday in Advent. And as many of you know already, it comes from 3rd Isaiah. And 3rd Isaiah essentially has 3 sections, 3 different moments in history. Part 1 is a body of prophecy that comes at the beginning before exile. And then 2nd Isaiah marks a dramatic shift in tone as we get initial words of comfort from God for those who are in exile, with the promise of restoration. And then we come to 3rd Isaiah. And in 3rd Isaiah, there are more words of comfort because the people are still waiting. They're still waiting for restoration. And so in some ways, 3rd Isaiah is kind of like that little wheel you get on your computer when you're waiting for something to download. It's coming, but we're still waiting. We're still waiting for the salvation of the Lord, and we're still waiting for all of those beautiful things that have been promised in this passage. We want good news for the oppressed. The brokenhearted want to be bound. Those who are captives want liberty, and prisoners want release. In some ways, perhaps the poignant beauty of this moment is that in 2020, these years are not that symbolic. We know something about this. Here, the good news is ironic. We will hear these words differently this year. people who have never felt oppressed feel pressure this year. People who have always enjoyed every liberty think differently about what it means to be captive. This year, our individual situations are causing us to think beyond ourselves and think about what's happening in the world at large. In some ways, it's like we're at a tipping point where we're moving from an individual lament to a communal lament. Things are so bad that we are all thinking about what's wrong in the world. This year, we are all living into Langston Hughes's question, what happens to a dream deferred? In Isaiah, the prophet offers words of hope, but I think we should note that the prophet's words are not new words. Isaiah 61 is a reworking of themes that we've already seen in Isaiah 42. In fact, we have a trajectory here that begins with Isaiah 42, and then we see it again in Isaiah 61, and then we see it again in the Gospels in Luke chapter 4. It's proof of an important biblical principle that anything worth saying should be said at least twice. So in this passage, we get to observe repetition, reuse, reinterpretation. It's all a remix. And this act of proclaiming God's faithfulness as we wait, itself, that act of proclamation becomes a practice. It becomes a ritual in the community of faith. We practice remembering God's goodness. And so the question before us, the question for our communities of faith and our congregations is the same question that the community in 3rd Isaiah faces. What is it like when we are tired of waiting? What are we to do when we too are beleaguered? This time it's not just the community of faith that needs a word of hope, it's the leaders who need a word of hope. We see these words of hope, but the reality is that we have nothing left. We're running on fumes. We're tired of masks. We're tired of politics. We're tired of social distancing. And so much of what is normal has ceased. So much of what is normal has ceased, but time seems to keep moving forward, and we find ourselves, as we move into the new liturgical year, right back in the time of 3rd Isaiah. And so in this moment of our embodiment, we need to imagine how we are going to carry hope in our own beleaguered vessels. So the first thing I hope we can do is imagine I want to invite you to imagine 2 moments. The first moment I want you to imagine is the moment of being empty. There's that moment, if you're a singer, when you have actually pushed everything out. The diaphragm has pushed all the way in and all the sound is out. Or that moment when you're listening to music and the last remnant of the note has gone away from your ear. And in that moment of emptiness, sometimes the immediate response is a longing to take back in, a longing to hear again, because what was just here was so beautiful. And that moment of emptiness, that moment of waiting, that moment of lament is a reminder that the thing we had was worth waiting for. The thing we are longing for is worth yearning for. What it means to be limited by time and space is that we cannot be everywhere at the same time. And so even in our fatigue, there is a moment for us to recognize that we can, in that emptiness, prepare ourselves to hear these words of hope. In our emptiness, I hope we can give ourselves permission to encourage ourselves. These words are for us, that we can receive the promise of God. And we can receive it in a new way, because in our emptiness, in our brokenness, in our lack of ability is a reality check. And the reality check is that even when we were at our best, even when we had all of our ducks in a row and things were working the way we wanted to, that we were never accomplishing this work in our own strength. We were never doing it on our own, and it has always been God. And so the same God who showed up when we were feeling great is the same God who is going to show up in us and through us in these difficult times. We are beleaguered, but we can still proclaim the good news. One of my favorite experiences in listening to music is listening to someone who clearly has an older voice, someone who was a diva in her heyday and now is older, and her voice won't do what it used to do. But I love listening not for what the voice cannot do, but for what is still there. When we proclaim God's word in our beleaguered state, when we are past our prime and in our imperfection, when we sing a song and we are slightly tone deaf, our unique embodiment offers the good news that the power is in the song. The power or the hope is in the words. In Advent, the hope is in the word. As leaders at this time in this year, we are those who sing a song, albeit, as Polly Murray would say, from a weary throat. That is our work for this year.
We're going to move into a time of reflection from James Farwell, and then a time of reflection from Marty Wheeler Burnett. And if you have questions for either of them or that are stirred by what they're saying, please do share them. And looking at the time, we may do a few after each section, but we'll definitely wrap back around at the end with a few questions as best we can.
So folks, I want to offer my reflections for you under the banner of a series of remembrances, reminders, if you like. And let me preface it by saying something that those who've joined us before have heard me say before, but it remains the case, I think. Remember that we have a liturgical ordo that's composed of elements around space, time, and rite. And we have definitely lost the capacity to share space with one another, at least in terms of being in body in the same place. Now, we still are in our bodies, and digital assembly is also a kind of assembly. So it's not that we can't be together at all, but we can't be together in the space where we feel as a body, the whole sensorium centered on font and word and table. So that's a loss that's not entirely recoverable at this moment. What that suggests to me is that we need to continue to work very hard to preserve what we can of people's experience of the other two elements of our liturgical ordo. One of those, of course, is the rites that we use, but the other is an attempt to help people mark time. This seems to me to be more important than ever as we go along, more important than the first time I found myself thinking about this, because I think we're all experiencing that odd sort of thing of moving from day to day to day, like we said to somebody the other day, like I'm moving through molasses. The normal markers and turning points through time are not there. There's so much sameness to it. I have to look at my calendar 4 times a day to remember what day of the week it is. So it's all the more important to give people some way to keep time. So the first thing I want to do is simply to remind you to create a pattern. During the incarnation cycle, you have given an enormous gift right off the bat to your people if you put some effort into developing a recognizable, feelable pattern of movement through the Sundays, through the feasts, through Christmas, Epiphany, etc. You have resources at your fingertips for those. And these are the resources that most of us have found ourselves using in one form or another. You have the office. You have the order of worship for evening, which can often be combined with other kinds of practices, as you know, like an agape meal. You have evening prayer. You have the liturgy of the word. We've all been calling it anti-communion. I thought that word was gone forever with the 79 book, and now here we are back again. but a freestanding liturgy of the word adapted. And sometimes some congregations are able to mark holy baptism by creative uses of what the rite allows and practices, for example, that it's perfectly appropriate for a layperson to do a baptism. So while that is not normative, during this period, it is possible to find ways to do baptism socially distanced with the presider present, and there are some people that are experimenting with that. The point here is that you have the resources you need. And let me say a word here right quick before we go to the next slide about something that's worrying me just a little bit right now. And it's the right kind of call, but I worry that even in its positive motivation, that it places more of a burden on folks than they can manage right now. And that is that we've got some folks who are seizing this moment and raising the clarion call that this is the time to reimagine liturgy, to move into new territory, to stretch out and invent new ways of prayer for the moment, etc. I want people to be imaginative, but I have to say at the end of the day, I think that's the wrong call at the moment. One of the things that the familiar rites bring to us in a time when everything else feels like a desert without any markers, what is brought to us by these rites is a level of familiarity. I think the imagination comes in wrestling with the rites we are given and finding a good rhythm that works for you in your place to draw us together again. Some of you are even catching in the chat what I'm after here, that we are remembered ourselves by returning to these rites to which we consent. So I do not think this is a moment for leaders, and particularly clergy. I'm talking to you for just a second. There is always an inclination among clergy that they have to watch to have a bit of a messiah or hero kind of complex. This is not the moment for you to rewrite the history of Western liturgy right now. Resist that temptation to that kind of idiosyncratic heroism. Use the rites we know. Use the rites you know your people know. Develop a pattern so that they can feel the movement from Advent to Christmas to the feast days following to the holy name of Jesus, etc. At the end of the day, this is how rituals do what they do, is by repetition and familiarity. You can like that or you can not like that, but that's what rituals do. So reach into the patterns that you know, develop a way, and you might want to freshen the sort of pattern that you've been using so far. Shake it up a bit. If you've been doing morning prayer and then doing a kind of an agape meal of some kind on feast days, you might want to change that up some, but establish a clear pattern, let people know what's coming, and then follow the pattern. The second thing I would want you to remember is the supplemental resources that you have to lay into your pattern. Remember, in the BOS 2018, you've got lots of cues for how to develop paraliturgical sorts of practices that either are laid on the top of a service of the liturgy of the word or in some ways have their own integrity. You've got an Advent wreath.
Jim, could I interrupt you? For those who are not Episcopalian, could you tell them what the BOS is?
Oh, sorry. Did I say BOS?
You did.
Book of Occasional Services 2018. If you're Presbyterian, you also have one of these, although it's a different book. The Book of Occasional Services, revised at our General Convention, our governing bodies meeting in 2018, is a collection of supplemental liturgical resources that do not have the status of the prayer book, but provide some liturgical cues rooted in tradition for other kind of practices that we can do. Thank you, Lisa. So lots of us already do things like Advent wreaths and candle lighting, and we know already that those can be adapted very easily to home practice. Imagine, as we've been doing morning prayer or liturgies of the word, doing lessons and carols in an online way. Over Zoom, it could involve a number of voices and people and readings and so forth. The agape meal that we've talked about before, I did not design you a fresh one this time around as I've done in the last 2 webinars, but if you look at those resources from our first 2 webinars and look at those as models, you can see how you yourself could craft a practice of agape meals that families and households, whether single or families in the household, might do together over Zoom. Of course, availing yourself of the blessing of the Creche for the eve of Christmas. Remember, you have the Feast of the Holy Name. Lord have mercy, who doesn't want to remember this coming January 1, the Feast of the Holy Name, as we move into a new secular year? 2020 has not turned out to be a lot of fun. And of course, the Feast of the Presentation. You get the idea. I don't want to leave out a mention of Los Posadas or an Our Lady of Guadalupe celebration, except I do want to note that so much of those 2 relatively new supplemental liturgies that we have are built around music. And Marty's going to help us think about some of that in short order here, but it could be that those kind of observances are a little difficult in this moment. But do know that they are there also for use in this time. The third thing I want you to remember is that there is a proposal out there. Some of my colleagues in liturgy are more enthusiastic about this than I am, but I'm warming to it a little. And that is that you might want to think about the practice of spiritual communion. And if you're in an environment where your bishop and your local governmental regulations are allowing you to pull something like this off in a socially distanced way, it's not totally out of order to imagine celebrating the Eucharist with a small socially distanced congregation present, and then using one of the several prayers, which you can easily find just by hopping on Google, that have been used over the years for this practice where the Eucharist is celebrated, but for one of any number of reasons, some or all members of the congregation are not receiving. Now, this is a more dominant sort of practice in the Roman Church than it has been for us. For us, it's really a matter of adapting a rubric from the ministration to the sick that encourages us to assure those, if they cannot receive communion when visited, in their illness, perhaps for some reason related to their health, can't receive, that we are to assure them that the Lord is present with them as if they had received, right? Now, for us, that means making in the moment something that is a rather idiosyncratic rubric in a pastoral rite sort of normal for our Sunday celebration. There are some drawbacks to that, but it may also be the case, particularly if this rolls on for a while, this situation that we're in, that certainly better than resorting to the problematic practices of online virtual Eucharist or sending the bread out in baggies around and all these kinds of things you see people doing. It may be that this might be a resource, but here's what I would suggest. If you do spiritual communion, do not simply adopt the several prayers that you will see in your research, again, just by a simple Google search. Don't just adopt those as the prayer that people say in response to the celebration, to the consecration. Because my concern about those prayers is that they are all oriented around individuals. They are very much about, Lord, I want to receive. I cannot receive you sacramentally right now, so come into my heart. Let's actually look at those prayers that are there for spiritual communion, bring the good savvy that you all have as liturgical leaders, and let's redraft those prayers just a bit so that there is more of a sense of corporate longing and corporate reassurance that people can feel if, in fact, you end up doing spiritual communion as something you want to try. My colleague Ruth Myers has written a nice piece on this that you can find in the by a quick search on the web. So has Max Johnson, a Lutheran colleague of mine who teaches at Notre Dame. Google those on your own time if you like. There's lots there about what defense could be made of a practice of spiritual communion. Again, this is not virtual communion. This is not online consecration. This is not those other kind of things that I don't think our sacramental theology can sustain. Final two things I want you to remember. First, God is present. God is at work in our longing and desire for God. Think about that against the background of this lovely meditation that Judy did for us. We are in such a consumer society where having is what we prefer over longing for. And this is a moment where we might help in our preaching and counsel and teaching, help the people we serve to embrace their longing and the absence of what we wish we had as a place that God is not just waiting for us beyond, but is actually present within. God is at work in our losses and grief. Surely this is what the Christ of death and resurrection is all about. And God is at the end up to something larger than just getting us through this pandemic. Nothing will separate us from the love of God. And remember also this, you do what you can. I really should have said this the way those of you who have taken me in class have heard me say it. You do what you can with what you got in the time you got available to do it in. That is okay. That is faithfulness. That is enough. Keep it simple if you need to. Keep it simple if your people need you to. Mark time with familiar resources. Scale what you can do to your bandwidth and your people. Trust God, all will be well. There is enough grace to get us through this. Be easy on yourselves. Trust God. That I leave you with at the moment.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Marty, for the gift of the music that we have been enjoying, and to our colleague, Kim Arakawa, who is responsible for helping us create the slide deck. I think we'll go to Marty and then gather the questions as we integrate our thoughts toward the end.
Thanks, Lisa. And hello, everyone. As my colleague James has outlined, it's going to be a very different Advent this year and Christmas, but there is much that is familiar. And as he said, there are familiar resources that we can use, things that we have to do what we need to do. So I'm going to focus on some of those today. As we start a new liturgical year in Advent, it's a time to think about setting that season apart and developing a pattern, as you've already heard. Focusing on the start of a new year, and that in itself brings us hope, right? 2020 has not been anyone's favorite year. A new liturgical year, a new opportunity. So if we can embrace it and be creative and think about a pattern that will set the season apart. One of the best ways to do that in terms of music is to choose different service music to use during a season and use it throughout the season. That provides a unifying element, and then it also changes the flavor of what we're doing and hearing and singing. So one thing that many churches do is to, instead of using the Gloria, which we should not use during Advent, we're using something else, and usually the Trisagion. And that's a great setting to think about using. There's several in the hymnal 1982 and some of the other denominational hymnals that you all bring to the table. One thing that I've found to be particularly effective, though, is to be able to use different texture, if you will, in music, different instrumentation, something different from just the usual organ and choir. Well, we don't have a choir anyway, probably by Advent. So we'll be using smaller ensembles or cantors. So one of the things that I'd like to propose for you, and we're going to listen to an example in just a minute, is a setting that I wrote for voices, unison voices, handbells, and flute or other C instrument. And so I'd like you to listen to this as we play it and imagine how something like this might sound in your own church to set Advent apart. So here's an example of something very simple that can be done with a minimal number of musicians, using it throughout the season that would give it a different texture, a different flavor, would help to set the season apart. Now, all of you are seeing the comments going by about wind instruments and COVID precautions and so forth. All of those are valid concerns. We have to take whatever we're adapting and apply it to our individual situations, right? But there are methods that some of you have already mentioned to pre-record different tracks and put them together. There are also ways to use bags or bell covers on other kinds of instruments to deal with the aerosol transmission from wind instruments. So there are ways that we can use those different instruments, and you can be creative with instrumentation. Use what you have, use what works in your own situation, and be creative. So I'd encourage you to think about service music for the season of Advent that will help to set the season apart. The piece that you just heard has been published by St. James Music Press, and it's available to those of you who are attending the webinar today as a free download for a limited number of weeks. There will be credits at the end and also on your resource sheet that you'll be receiving from Lisa. So if you liked it and thought that it might be useful in your parish, I'd really encourage you to download it and use it, and let me know how it goes. Let me know how your people like it, and I'd be interested to hear. So feel free to use it if you would like to use it. Let's talk a little bit about choral music. Now, all of you are in different situations in terms of what's being allowed in your diocese. Whether some places are not allowing choirs at all, some people are coming back to choral singing, but with socially distanced singers, smaller numbers, smaller ensembles. The fact of the matter is that we're all in very different situations, and none of us know exactly where we're going to be by December. So the key here, I think, when thinking about choral music for the season is flexibility. Flexibility has always been the watchword for church musicians, right? But now even more so in this time. So as we're looking at Christmas music and trying to plan ahead, because goodness knows all of us musicians like to have a plan, right? The important thing here is to have options, to have that flexibility built in. One of the things that's been expressed to me as a need, and something we've tried to address here at BTS, is to provide some resources of anthems that will work for soloists, for cantors, for small ensembles, duets, trios, for example, or even a small choir. And within those have things that have that flexibility where if something changes between now and December, you can easily pivot and adapt, right? So my colleague, Ellen Johnston, who's the Senior Associate for Music, Liturgy, and the Arts at Lifelong Learning at VTS, and I have put together a great resource that I think you will find helpful, and this will be made available to you after the webinar as well. It has a listing of lots and lots of unison, 2-part, and 3-part anthems, things that can be used with a solo voice, with duets, trios, or small ensembles, which are some of the options that many churches are looking at this Advent and this Christmas. And it was fun putting it together because Ellen and I have known each other a long time. We had a lot of the same things on our list, but we also had very different things too. And I was able to see what she picked and vice versa. So I think you'll find it a really interesting resource and encourage you to take a look at it. Things from all different style periods, different types of music, different languages. Certainly you want to use some familiar things, but you might want to try something different in the mix of music during these seasons. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it and let it inspire your own creativity in terms of thinking about flexible options. This is an opportunity to try something new and develop a more diverse repertoire. Let's talk a little bit about Christmas. We've been talking about Advent. Christmas in particular, I think people are going to be wanting familiar carols, that need for the familiar. We don't want to reinvent Christmas. That won't be helpful, I don't think. People are going to want familiar carols, and they're going to want the opportunity to sing along in some way. So those are things I think that we need to keep in mind when we're planning. If you work in a large church, perhaps you're used to having organ and brass and all kinds of bells and whistles for Christmas Eve. That may not be happening this year, right? And in fact, when we're planning music, we want to think about, instead of what's going to work well in the room, we want to think about, if we're doing live stream, what's going to work well on video. And those may be two very different kinds of things in terms of instrumentation and resources. So thinking about what works on video well instead of in person. It may be different instrumentation than you've ever used before on Christmas Eve. It might be, for example, harp more of the time than organ. So think creatively about what you can use and what your resources are in your own parish. Another thing that I'd like for you to think about is how we can encourage singing through the entire Christmas season, not just on Christmas Eve. And we've talked already about some of the different options for lessons and carols. So I had an idea about that, which might be that throughout the 12 days of Christmas, we could have a carol of the day. This is something you could easily do with video resources and use different groups within the parish, different families, different age ranges, recording some of these favorite Christmas carols. Have one a day, and then maybe on 12th night, you could have a virtual carol sing, and you could plug all of them together. So again, here's working smart, right? Rather than creating new thing after new thing after new thing, how about figuring out ways that you can use things that you do more than once? So have some pre-recorded Christmas carols. You can have one a day during the season, so we're keeping that time, and then have an opportunity to string them together and make a really fun lessons and carols or carol sing for Christmas. So those are some ideas for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the Christmas season. As James already mentioned, there are also the options for lots of special services that are in the book of occasional services. And these are opportunities to do creative things with music. Advent lessons and carols, which is a service that I dearly love. This is a chance to use different readers, different music, and to make it simple with smaller ensembles or soloists or duets. A great way to create anthems is to use your own hymnal. And one of the things that's in the resource list that Ellen Johnston and I put together is a listing of lots of hymns. The ones we picked were from the Hymnal 1982 and Wonder, Love, and Praise, but you could easily adapt this to other denominational hymnals. How to take those anthems and with just a little bit of creative rearranging, how to turn them into anthems for your soloist or your duet or your small ensemble choir. There's lots of creative ideas in there to think about how you can take those hymns and adapt them into anthems. And it may be then that will spark your own imagination for creating your own arrangements. So taking something that's familiar, once again, and injecting a creative approach to it. Advent hymns are some of my favorite hymns in the hymnal. They're great Advent hymns, but people don't know them as well because it's a short season. It's only 4 Sundays, and we don't get to repeat them as much and learn them as well. So lessons and carols, Advent lessons and carols is a great additional opportunity for teaching these hymns, which are so powerful to me, especially at this time. So I would encourage you to look at the Advent lessons and carols liturgy and think about ways you could do that virtually to be able to use pre-recorded lessons and anthems, soloist, instruments, creating something that will be really meaningful to people in your congregation. You might want to try a liturgy that you haven't done before. We don't need to reinvent everything about Advent, but it might be fun to try one new thing. And James already mentioned some of the resources in Book of Occasional Services, and other denominations have similar sorts of resources. The Blessing of the Creche, Las Posadas, Our Lady of Guadalupe, those all have suggestions for music. Now, again, maybe you can do that, maybe you can't in your diocese or in your particular setting. But if you can use some music, again, it wouldn't have to be an entire mariachi ensemble, for example, for Las Posadas. It could be something much simpler. So you could re-envision, use the suggestions that are already in Book of Occasional Services, but reimagine how you might do that with a different number of performers and in a different way. Another service that we don't think of much that's in there is the service for New Year's Eve. And again, you know, this is going to be something to celebrate, right? We're going to be ready for 2020 to end and a new calendar year in this case to begin. And wouldn't it be interesting to be creative to do something with that for your congregation that could be available online? So again, I would by no means recommend trying to do all of those things for the first time, but it might be fun to pick one of them and be creative. Finally, I'd like to say something about our choirs. Choirs are sometimes one of the most active and devoted groups within a parish. Choirs become much more than a musical ensemble. They become a community of faith. They pray for one another. They support one another. They're deeply grounded in the liturgy and song of the church. And choirs are suffering, as we all know. It's a central piece of people's lives. It's the primary way that many of our people pray, and they have lost touch with that. So throughout this season, instead of focusing on the busyness that we often encounter in preparing for these seasons, Advent and Christmas, let's think about what we can do to provide pastoral care and relief and grace for our choir members. There'll be a sense of grief. This is something people really look forward to, is being able to sing the great music of Advent and Christmas, and it's looking like they won't have that opportunity this year. So it's important to start now to think about what we're going to provide for our choirs. so that they can pray and worship and celebrate together at this holy time. There are lots of different things that are being done, and there's a wide range to choose from. Some churches are having an online compline service for their choir members once a week. Some places are doing virtual choirs. Now, if you're good at that and you like the technology, it's a great way to involve people, right? It's great for our congregations because they can see familiar faces and hear familiar voices, and that can be very meaningful in this time. It's also a tremendous amount of work. And those of you who are in the meeting today who have done virtual choirs know that it is time-consuming work and challenging work. We have to think about pacing ourselves and what's the best use of our time, and what will be most productive and helpful. So doing a virtual choir every week might not be realistic. Maybe trying to do one might be interesting and fun sometime during the fall. It depends on what your technical capability is, what kind of resources you have, and honestly, what feels right to you in your own situation. This is a great season to think about educational opportunities for choirs, and this would apply, I've talked a lot about adults, but this would apply to children and youth as well. Lots of places are doing creative things with education. And if you think about adult choirs, we don't always think in terms of providing education about church music, right? We think about what we're going to sing next Sunday and getting the notes learned. But this is a great opportunity to step back and perhaps study some of those great choral works and look at them in a fresh light and study them from a theological perspective. There's some great resources out there. For example, Kerygma has a study on Handel's Messiah. How interesting would that be to work through some lessons about that great work and the scripture contained in it and understand it at a deeper level. So I would encourage you to think about something, one of these, again, not all of them, because we have to pace ourselves and exercise self-care as ministers. But if you can think about a way that you can intentionally design programming for your choirs that will help them worship and pray together during this season of the year, I think it'll be meaningful and important. And don't forget the social side, right? Everybody's going to miss being together. So we have to find some way, if we can't gather in person, to be able to gather virtually and celebrate the grace that we find in our communities. So those are some ideas about music for Advent and Christmas. And again, I would just echo what James said, that we want to keep a pattern. We want to be consistent with that pattern. We need to not try to do everything, do what we can. God gives us the resources to do what we need to do in the places where we are, and to remember that this is a celebration of a new year and new hope, and rejoice in that hope.
Thank you, Marty, so much. You were hoping to avoid it, but there are several questions about copyright in the Q&A. So I think the general question is, what is your current recommendation about how people access permissions most effectively? So one of the questions is, do you have any advice on the music-heavy season when it comes to copyright permissions and recordings?
Well, that's a huge topic, but I'll give it a shot. So copyright issues have been the bane of the existence of most church musicians, who inevitably are the ones who are tasked with it, right? Because we care passionately about the moral imperative of making sure that our composers and artists within the church are compensated for their work and honored appropriately. And we also need to be in compliance with the law. Those of us who are members of professional organizations in church music, that's part of our code of ethics. So everybody's trying to do their very best, but it isn't easy. Obviously, any material that's copyrighted, you have to have permission to use. And the advent of everyone doing live streaming has taken it to a whole nother level, because you have to have separate licenses to cover live streaming activities. So there are companies that specialize in this. The two that are probably most familiar are One License, which for Episcopalians covers most things, not all, but most things in our hymnal and supplements, and many other member publishers that they represent. There's also CCLI, which tends to cover more contemporary music, popular religious song, contemporary Christian music. So between those two, it covers much of what we do. But in terms of planning, everything that's copyrighted has to have permission from the publisher or through one of these licenses. There's a very detailed article on the website of Association of Anglican Musicians. And when it's someone else's turn to talk, I will try to post it in the chat, and we can maybe add it to the resource page as well. But copyright is an important issue. It's a time-consuming task, but it's very important. And so we want to make sure that we are in compliance with copyright laws and the sense of fairness that they provide for our musicians and artists. Did you see other specific questions, Lisa, that you'd like me to respond to?
I think that's good for right now. I mean, there's a lot of commentary about how helpful this is, and the resources are going to be so valuable. There's a question about that either you or James could answer. This may have gotten lost in the chat. What is the background for No Gloria in Advent?
I'll let James take that one while I look up the link.
Advent, in its source, actually is a penitential season. I understand that Episcopalians love to argue about this, but the historical evidence is fairly clear. So the dropping of the Gloria and the replacement of it with Kyrie or Trisagion in Advent is because Advent and Lent are two penitential preparatory seasons leading to two major high feasts. That's the short answer.
I'm wondering if Judy has any thoughts as a Baptist in this circle, who's very familiar with the Episcopal tradition, but we have others on this that are neither Baptist nor Episcopalian. What have you heard or seen in your tradition, in your community, that is helping people orient towards accessible worship?
I think that, well, in our tradition, preached word is central, the liturgy of the word. And so we put a lot of our effort into that aspect of worship. I think the other thing that's really helped unite people is prayer. So in our church, we used to have a Friday prayer call-in. We do that every day of the week now. And we will have, maybe 300 people on Monday, but as many as 1,000 people on Friday. And I know it's a way for people to feel connected to one another at this time. And so I'm going to be interested in seeing what practices we develop in this time become regular practices when we find ourselves together again.
Lisa, could I address something I see sort of popping up here and there in the Q&A is kind of some concern for marking mourning. People are talking about Blue Christmas services, et cetera, and so forth. It is important for us to find ways to mark what we have lost. And Advent is a perfectly appropriate time to do that. Remember that, not that we emphasize it perhaps as often as we should. Remember that the whole of Advent is a kind of eschatological proclamation that is leading us toward the celebration of a birth that will be accompanied by signs of the loss, the Pasch, the resurrection that is to come. So it's not importing something into Advent unusual to find ways to mark our sense of mourning and loss. That's part of the incarnational celebration. I think there are ways in which we liturgical leaders can get ourselves psyched out, particularly about this coming season, because it's so much about embodiment, and we can't get together in bodies, in shared space, in many cases at least. And so the temptation is immediately go down the road to thinking, well, oh my God, there's just no way to celebrate this incarnational season. But our losses in the body are also part of the incarnation. Our desire to be present with other people in body when we can't is also a part of the human experience that Jesus enters into in the fullness of his own incarnation. So I certainly don't think you should be reticent at all during the Advent season and even amidst the Christmas season to help find ways to express liturgically the losses people feel. We always set that into context of the hope that God inhabits these losses and will redeem them. And you all know that. And that's the work of the preacher in particular during this period to keep calling us back to that. So absolutely find spaces for your congregations to mourn. You cannot speak the word of hope into the space if the mourning isn't named to begin with, right?
Thank you. I was struck when you were saying that on a very practical level. One of my hopes, I think, about us living through this very different experience of the incarnational seasons is that we might lose some of the sappiness that sometimes, I think, covers over the significance of the season. Some of those romanticized traditions that we have that are so habitual, which verse you dim the lights on for Silent Night, at which moment in the congregation. It's not that I don't honor that those are also rituals for people in some way, but unless we're unpacking them and really reflecting on our embodied experience of the mystery that is God in that moment, they really do just become sort of checklist, okay, now I've done Christmas Eve. So I'm thinking that from my own experience, especially for multiple generations of experience of this season, I think we're going to find ourselves going more deeply into the both and of joy and despair, of emptiness and hope. I think that's very real in our Christian journey, and these seasons are ripe with imagery and practices that will bring us to that. There have been several questions about offline resources. I'm going to share a few good ideas with you, I hope, in just a few minutes. I'm just trying to catch questions here that my colleagues have stirred, and to make sure that we've done some justice to your participation in this very active chat box and Q&A box. You'll receive everything from us. Where in the midst of the season should we create spaces for mourning? We've kind of talked about that. I think anyone thinking about a 7-week Advent, that's a question somebody raised. And then Dr. Judy, you were asked about how you actually do the prayer call-in, like the practical question. Do you want to just answer that? Several people have asked it.
I just put something in the chat box. We just have a
thank
call-in line with an ID code and have folks that are designated to lead that in the morning. Yeah. So the beauty of the phone, obviously, is that you can have people who aren't members connect as well.
Right. Someone who says how people are planning to handle the wider community, the public role congregations have at Christmas, particularly if your in-person worship is limited in number. This is a time when we often see those once or occasional people, right? Are you offering more services? Are you changing the worship schedule? What are you doing? Suggestions from my colleagues. What do you think is wise about that?
Marty, do you want to lead off?
Well, sure. I think that that live streaming is here to stay, right? So I think regardless of what happens, we're going to be looking at a robust online offering for our churches. And that may allow us to reach even more people at Christmas. So again, trying to take a positive look at that. Every place is so different in terms of what's going to be allowed, and we don't even know what that is in terms of how many people can be in a building. So I'm not sure we can answer that today for everybody. It's going to be a continuing effort to stay flexible and see what we can do. Mm-hmm. But if you haven't started planning for a robust online offering for Christmas Eve, now's the time.
Yeah, and I would add, although this is not a resource that we have to sort of put before you right here and now in this moment, but let's not forget that the Episcopal Church didn't just start live streaming worship. Big places have been live streaming worship for a long time. Our ecumenical colleagues have been live streaming worship for a long time. So there's a lot of folks out there that you could reach out to in your own diocese and your own denominations who are already accustomed to what it's like when the service can gather normally, but they're also live streaming, right? It used to be for the shut-ins, now it's for all of us, right? But there's got to be some learned wisdom there from folks that have been live streaming for 30 years. Good Lord, St. Luke's Atlanta was online with its worship service when I was back there in the late 80s, early 90s. And there are others as well. The cathedral where I used to serve always live streamed the Christmas Eve liturgy. So I think it's the right instinct to begin thinking, as Marty just said, that is probably here to stay, regardless of when we get to the end game around the social distancing. And so we've got things to learn here.
We actually have a webinar coming up about live streaming. So Lisa will say more about that later.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that and say that for those large churches that have been live streaming, there's also been a movement for a lot of them now to pre-record services because now that is the only worship experience. And so there is thought about how we want to manage that. So there are a lot of interesting things developing in churches.
I think want to commend some of the creativity I'm seeing in the chat box to expand our imagination about what being present to the wider community looks like in this season. So it's not just located at 10 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. What would it be? I saw someone here saying that she's thinking about doing a Grinch Christmas outside the congregation. I think the idea, some congregations are already thinking about creating kits that people can drive by and pick up that have blessings and home prayers and suggestions about how to create a creche at home, how to create a rhythm, a ritual for your place, your people. These are evangelism opportunities. These are opportunities to do more than just receive people into our building for an hour and a half on Christmas Eve. So I think if you can cultivate relationships with and know your community well, know what the needs might be. Perhaps it's tied to a social outreach that is already a part of your ongoing life. Is there something that you can couple around the care for the poor or the care for those who are unhoused that brings Christmas to them, not just as a token gift, but much more as a practice of embodied prayer or a practice of some kind of moment that they recognize they are not alone. So I think thinking about Christmas particularly, but Advent too, as a season of invitation, this is another way to activate lay people in your congregations who are wondering how they can be more effective in their call to ministry. They're busy doing their daily lives, but would love to give back to the world. And is there a gift that they have that they could orient around a physical presence in the neighborhood? Is there something that they could give, create artistically, or chalk drawings on your parking lot floor ground? What is it you can do to celebrate the depth of purpose of these seasons? I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Let me share a couple of resources that I want to commend to you. This is just a kind of an invitation to be aware of a new resource that's coming out. A colleague of ours, Jamie Martin Curry, who's a longtime Christian formation leader in the Episcopal Church, is working with Episcopal Relief and Development to create resources for Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany for households that do not involve technology. They are practices and projects that are informative and committed to the Christian call to redemption and social justice, but they are oriented around prayerful practices. So she has created these resources. They will be available very soon through Episcopal Relief and Development, all downloadable, all shareable. These are just examples of some of the things. There's a block creche. The focus of it is on vulnerable children who are marginalized, invisible, unseen, forgotten. So it's an invitation for people of all ages in our congregations to mark the season while committing themselves to pray for and stand with people who are forgotten and overlooked too often in our cultures. This is a wonderful piece. This is how she's creating these Creche scenes, and they're putting real faces and real people in real time on these stick figures. So it's something very tangible. It's something that is designed to create rhythm and that set of practices that James has been talking about in the home, some consistency around the season. Then I want to share that we also have something many of you may know about and have participated in for years now, but we offer something called Advent Word. And our colleague Sarah Stonecipher-Boylan is at the heart of this. It is an opportunity for you to invite people to pray daily through visual imagery, visual ways of being connected to the narrative that is the Advent process. There are key words that a team of people discerned out of the lectionary texts for the Advent season. Each day there's a word, and there will be a reflection written and a visual meditation that is circulated. You are then invited to respond to those texts and that visual meditation with your own posting using the hashtag Advent Word. And this has become a global, beautiful expression of daily prayer and preparation. So if you want to know more about that, you can go and sign up at adventword.org. But it is a quiet way that anyone can be involved and be connected to the invitation that God is inviting us to come again and to be renewed again at the birth of his Son. Many of you know this, but we have a website here at Virginia Seminary called Building Faith. The URL is buildfaith.org. If you go to it, which has just newly been revised and refreshed, thanks to our editor for that, Sarah Bentley Allred, and our Christian Formation Director, Catherine Malloy, they have overseen a project that has brought this site to life even more fully. But if you just search in the search bar for Advent, you will find a number of posts that are there waiting for you, inviting the kinds of practices that will not require online connectivity and invite intergenerational experience of these seasons. So in Advent, there's something about antiphons for Advent. This is another place to connect desire, longing, grief, uncertainty with the season. There's Advent at home. There's praying with icons with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. If you if you go in there and search for Christmas, you'll find equally a number of resources that are adaptable and for your context, but again, will engage people of all ages or households in the possibility of expressing this season more fully. So you see some samples there: 5 household rituals for Christmas Eve, practicing Christmas at home, and the one about keeping the 12 days of Christmas. Let's again remember, it is a 12-day season. There's a lot to offer. And as Marty just mentioned, we in fact have another webinar tomorrow. And for those of you who are at that tipping point of feeling like you are trying live streaming, or you are about to, or you feel like you're not doing it as well as you would like to, you may want to participate in this webinar. It is specifically about what we have learned through this season as congregations and faith communities about live streaming in a meaningful way, so that the center of our experience is worship, not technology. So how do we do this well? What have we learned from each other? And that is available to you through lifelong learning. Before we leave, I just want to say again to my colleagues how deeply grateful I am for the time they made to be with us. And thank you for participating with us in what is a season of incredible demand already, the beginning of the program year, the beginning of the school year, the month of living under a pandemic and living with all of the social unrest that we've been describing. We're grateful for the time you spent here, and we will be sending you as many of the resources as we have seen elevated in the chat and that we have curated. I will save the chat, I will clean it up, it will be posted. So some of those links that you might not have caught will come to you in the chat also. And if you need more and you know how to find us, we are at lifelong learning at vts.edu. Thank you, friends. Thank you, colleagues. Is there any last word that one of you wanted to get out that I cut you off on? You ready for a snack? Ready for your break? I just want to say thank you. And with this verse from O come, Emmanuel, we will leave our way, and I will be sharing at the slide after this has the music credits. O come, thou dayspring from on high, and cheer us by thy drawing nigh. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to light. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Blessings to you all, and be well.